The phenomenon, known to history as British gang culture, emerged not as a single organisation, but as a network of territorial criminal enterprises which developed across the industrial cities of England, Scotland and Wales from the late 19th century onwards. Unlike the hierarchical structure of the Italian mafia or the centralized cartels of Latin America, British gangs have typically operated as fragmented groups, each controlling specific neighborhoods or boroughs within larger urban areas. The major centers of gang activity have historically been concentrated in the cities of London, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool and Glasgow, though organized criminal groups have operated in virtually every significant urban area in Britain over the past 150 years. The definition of what constitutes a gang in the British context has varied considerably over time and between different law enforcement agencies. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, gangs were typically understood to be groups of young men engaged in street violence and petty crime within defined territorial boundaries. By the late 20th century, however, the term had come to encompass more sophisticated criminal organizations involved in drug trafficking, firearms offenses, money laundering, and systematic violence. Modern British law enforcement generally defines a gang as a group of 3 or more individuals who engage in criminal activity together and who have a collective identity, often expressed through names, symbols, or territorial claims. The criminal activities undertaken by British gangs have expanded considerably over the decades. In the Victorian and Edwardian periods, gangs primarily engaged in protection rackets, street robbery, and violent territorial disputes. By the mid-20th century, organized crime groups had diversified into gambling, prostitution, armed robbery, and fraud. The introduction of widespread drug trafficking in the 1970s and 1980s fundamentally altered the scale and profitability of gang activity, while the subsequent decades saw further expansion into firearms importation, human trafficking, and cybercrime. Although the nature of gang activity has evolved considerably over the past century and a half, the fundamental structure of territorial control and violent intimidation has remained remarkably consistent throughout British gang culture. It is worth reflecting on the development of Britain's major cities, within which these criminal organizations would become so intrinsically associated. It is worth reflecting on the development of Britain's major cities, within which organized criminal gangs would become so intrinsically associated. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century, transformed the country from a predominantly rural society into the world's first industrialized nation. This economic transformation was accompanied by rapid urbanization as agricultural workers migrated to cities in search of employment in the new factories, mills, and industrial works which were being established across the country. Industrial works which were being established across the country. The population of Britain's major cities expanded at an extraordinary rate during the 19th century. London, already a significant urban centre with a population of approximately 1 million people in 1800, had grown to over 4 million inhabitants by 1900. Manchester, which had been a market town of some 25,000 people in 1772, had expanded to over 300,000 by the middle of the 19th century. Birmingham's population increased from 71,000 in 1801 to over 500,000 by 1900, while Liverpool grew from 82,000 to over 700,000 during the same period. Glasgow, which had numbered approximately 77,000 people in 1801, had become a city of over 750,000 by the turn of the 20th century. And this growth did not stop there. By the mid-20th century, London's population had reached over 8 million people, while Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and Glasgow had all become major metropolitan areas with populations exceeding 1 million when including their surrounding suburbs. This rapid urbanization created sprawling working-class neighborhoods characterized by overcrowded housing, inadequate sanitation, and severe poverty. The slum districts, which developed in every major city, became breeding grounds for criminal activity, as unemployment, poor living conditions, and lack of social mobility left many with few legitimate opportunities for advancement. This was the environment of urban squalor and economic desperation interwoven. By the late 19th century, organized street gangs had emerged in virtually every major industrial city in Britain. The most prominent of these early criminal organizations were the Scuttlers of Manchester, gangs of young men who operated in the working-class districts of the city from the 1870s through to the 1890s. The Scuttlers, who took their name from a local term for a fight or brawl, were characterized by their distinctive dress, which included bell-bottom trousers, brass-tipped pointed clogs, and peaked caps worn at an angle. These gangs engaged in territorial violence, with rival groups from different neighborhoods fighting pitched battles over control of streets and markets. In Birmingham, similar gangs emerged in the 1890s and operated into the 1910s. These groups, which became known as the Peaky Blinders, controlled various districts in the city and were involved in protection rackets, illegal gambling, and violent territorial disputes. Like the Scuttlers, the Peaky Blinders were identifiable by their dress, which included flat caps, waistcoats, and silk scarves. Meanwhile, in Glasgow, gangs armed with razors had established control over sections of the city's poorer neighborhoods, while Liverpool saw the emergence of comparable criminal groups operating along similar lines. The activities of these early gangs were primarily focused on territorial control and petty crime. Members engaged in protection rackets, demanding money from local shopkeepers and market traders in exchange for security from violence. Street robbery, theft, and assault were commonplace, and clashes between rival gangs frequently resulted in serious injuries and occasional deaths. Police records from the period indicate that hundreds of young men were arrested each year for gang-related offences in cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow. However, these early gangs were largely disorganised compared to what would follow in the 20th century. The subsequent development of organised crime in Britain has to be considered in light of the country's social and economic history in the 20th century. Subsequent development of organised crime in Britain has to be considered in light of the country's social and economic history in the 20th century and the development of both legitimate and illicit markets there. In some senses, crime and social policy cannot be disentangled in modern Britain, as the conditions which allowed organised gangs to flourish were directly connected to broader patterns of economic decline, social fragmentation, and political decisions, which shaped the country in the decades following the Second World War. The immediate post-war period in Britain, from 1945 through to the early 1950s, was characterized by severe economic austerity and rationing. The country had emerged victorious from the war, but at enormous financial cost. and the government was forced to maintain strict controls on the distribution of food, clothing, and other essential goods. This rationing system, which in some cases extended until 1954, created extensive opportunities for black market activities. Criminal organizations, which could acquire rationed goods illegally and sell them at inflated prices, generated substantial profits during this period. The black market in meat, butter, clothing coupons, and petrol became a significant source of income for criminal groups in cities such as London, Manchester, and Birmingham, and established networks which would later be adapted for other illicit trades. As Britain began to recover economically in the 1950s, the country entered a period of relative prosperity, which lasted through much of the 1960s. However, this prosperity was unevenly distributed, and large sections of the working class in Britain's major cities continued to live in substandard housing with limited economic opportunities. The slum clearance programs, which had been initiated in the 1930s, accelerated after the war, but the replacement housing often consisted of hastily constructed tower blocks and council estates, which concentrated poverty and social problems in specific geographic areas. These estates, built on the outskirts of major cities or in redeveloped inner city areas, would eventually become the territorial bases for many of Britain's most violent gangs. The 1960s saw the beginning of significant immigration to Britain from the Commonwealth countries, particularly from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. The British Nationality Act of 1948 had granted citizens of Commonwealth countries the right to live and work in Britain, and in the decades that followed, hundreds of thousands of people took advantage of this provision. Between 1948 and 1971, approximately 500,000 people migrated to Britain from the Caribbean alone, with a majority settling in London, Birmingham, and other major cities where employment opportunities existed. Immigration from South Asia was also substantial, with estimates suggesting that over 300,000 people from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh had settled in Britain by 1970. These new communities faced considerable discrimination in employment and housing, and many immigrants found themselves concentrated in the poorest neighborhoods of Britain's cities. The children of these immigrants, born and raised in Britain, but facing limited opportunities owing to racism and economic marginalization, would in many cases become involved in gang activity in the 1970s and 1980s. The cultural dynamics of gang membership shifted considerably as a result of immigration, with new forms of criminal organization emerging alongside the traditional white British gangs, which had dominated urban crime in the first half of the 20th century. Simultaneously with these demographic changes, Britain was experiencing the beginning of significant economic decline. The country's manufacturing base, which had been the foundation of its industrial power since the 19th century, began to contract in the 1960s, and this process accelerated dramatically in the 1970s and 1980s. Traditional industries such as coal mining, steel production, shipbuilding, and textile manufacturing, which had provided employment for millions of people, entered terminal decline as a result of foreign competition, outdated infrastructure, and changing global economic conditions. The unemployment rate in Britain, which had remained below 3% for most of the 1950s and 1960s, began to rise sharply in the 1970s, reaching over 5% by the middle of the decade. This economic decline was particularly severe in the industrial cities of northern England, the Midlands, and Scotland, where entire communities had been built around specific industries. In cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, and Glasgow, unemployment rates in certain neighbourhoods reached 20% or higher during the 1970s and 1980s. Young men growing up in these areas faced the prospect of long-term unemployment and limited prospects for legitimate economic advancement. As a result, many turned to crime as a means of generating income, and the gangs, which had traditionally been involved in protection rackets and petty theft, began to professionalize their operations and expand into more lucrative criminal enterprises. The rise of drug culture in Britain during the 1960s and 1970s provided new opportunities for criminal organizations. Cannabis use, which had been relatively rare in Britain before the 1960s, became increasingly common among young people during the decade, particularly in London and other major cities. The number of cannabis-related offences recorded by police increased from fewer than 1,000 in 1960 to over 15,000 by 1970, a figure which would continue to rise dramatically in the decades that followed. Heroin use also increased during the 1970s, though it remained relatively uncommon compared to cannabis. The number of registered heroin addicts in Britain increased from approximately 400 in 1960 to over 2,800 by 1976. These drugs were initially imported by relatively small-scale operators, but by the late 1970s, organized criminal groups had recognized the substantial profits to be made from drug trafficking and had begun to establish systematic importation and distribution networks. The gangs, which controlled specific neighborhoods in cities such as London, Manchester, and Liverpool, were well positioned to dominate the street-level drug trade in their territories, and drug dealing became an increasingly important source of income for these organizations. The traditional criminal activities such as protection rackets and armed robbery continued, but drug trafficking would eventually become the primary source of revenue for most major gangs in Britain. The election of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in 1979 marked the beginning of a period of dramatic economic and social change in Britain. The Thatcher administration implemented a program of economic liberalization which included the privatization of state-owned industries, the reduction of trade union power, and the dismantling of much of the country's remaining manufacturing base. These policies, while generating economic growth in certain sectors and regions, had devastating effects on the traditional industrial areas of Britain. Unemployment reached over 3 million people by 1983, representing approximately 11% of the workforce, with rates in some cities and regions reaching 15% or higher. The result of these economic policies was a further concentration of poverty and unemployment in specific geographic areas, particularly in the inner cities and the council estates which surrounded them. The riots which occurred in Brixton in London, Toxteth in Liverpool, and Moss Side in Manchester in 1981 were direct expressions of the anger and frustration felt by communities which had been left behind by economic change. These disturbances, which involved extensive property damage and violent confrontations with police, demonstrated the extent to which social cohesion had broken down in certain areas. The riots also illustrated the extent to which relations between police and communities, particularly communities with large minority populations, had deteriorated. Police corruption and ineffectiveness in combating organized crime during this period has been well documented. In London, investigations in the late 1970s revealed extensive corruption within the Metropolitan Police, with numerous officers found to have been accepting bribes from criminals in exchange for turning a blind eye to illegal activities or providing advance warning of police operations. The most serious scandal involved officers in the Obscene Publications Squad who were found to have been taking regular payments from pornography dealers. Similar problems existed in other police forces across the country, and the effectiveness of law enforcement in combating organized crime was severely compromised as a result. The housing policies implemented during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s also contributed to the conditions which allowed gang culture to flourish. The tower blocks and large council estates, which had been constructed in the post-war period, were increasingly recognized as social failures. These developments, often built with poor quality materials and inadequate planning, became plagued by crime, vandalism, and social problems. The concentration of economically marginalized families in these estates created environments in which gang membership became normalized for many young people. The estates in areas such as Hackney and Tottenham in London, Moss Side in Manchester, and Easterhouse in Glasgow became notorious for gang activity and drug dealing. The breakdown of traditional social structures also played a role in the rise of gang culture during this period. The decline of traditional industries meant the loss not only of employment, but also of the social institutions and community structures which had been associated with those industries. Working men's clubs, trade unions, and other organizations which had provided social cohesion and a sense of identity for working-class communities declined along with the industries they had served. In many areas, gangs began to fill the void left by the collapse of these traditional structures, providing young men with a sense of belonging and identity, which was otherwise lacking. Family structures also underwent significant changes during this period. The divorce rate in Britain increased substantially from the 1960s onwards, particularly after the Divorce Reform Act of 1969 made it easier to dissolve marriages. The proportion of single-parent households increased correspondingly, with many children growing up without fathers present. Research conducted in the 1980s and 1990s indicated that young people from single-parent households were statistically more likely to become involved in criminal activity than those from two-parent households, though the relationship between family structure and criminality was complex and mediated by numerous other factors, including poverty and neighborhood conditions. Educational opportunities for young people in deprived areas were also limited. Schools in poorer neighborhoods often struggled with inadequate funding, high staff turnover, and discipline problems. Many young people left school at the minimum leaving age, with few or no qualifications, limiting their prospects for employment in an economy which was increasingly demanding higher levels of education and skills. The result was that by the 1980s, large numbers of young people in Britain's major cities were facing long-term unemployment with little prospect of improvement. All of this was happening as demand for illegal narcotics was increasing dramatically in Britain. Cannabis use continued to expand, with estimates suggesting that several million people in Britain had used the drug by the mid-1980s. More significantly, heroin use increased substantially during the 1980s, particularly in areas of high unemployment. The number of registered heroin addicts increased from approximately 5,000 in 1980 to over 15,000 by 1985, though these official figures significantly underestimated true scale of heroin use, as many addicts were not registered with authorities. Heroin became endemic in certain deprived neighbourhoods in cities such as Edinburgh, Glasgow, Liverpool and Manchester, creating a large market for drug dealers and generating substantial profits for the gangs which controlled the trade. This was the environment into which Britain's modern organised criminal gangs were emerging in the 1960s, 1970s and 1980s. By the 1960s, a new generation of criminals had emerged in Britain who were more organised, more violent and more ambitious than the street gangs which had preceded them. These individuals and the organisations they led represented a fundamental shift in the nature of British organised crime, moving away from the relatively unsophisticated territorial violence and petty crime of the Victorian and Edwardian gangs towards more professional criminal enterprises. The criminals who rose to prominence during this period treated crime as a business, establishing hierarchical structures, maintaining financial records, and developing systematic methods for evading law enforcement. The professionalization of crime during the 1960s was driven in part by the opportunities presented by post-war Britain's economic growth and changing social patterns. The expansion of legitimate businesses such as nightclubs, gambling establishments, and property development provided opportunities for criminals to establish seemingly legal fronts for their activities, while also generating substantial income through protection rackets. Business owners who refused to pay for protection faced intimidation, violence, and property damage, and the sums extracted through these rackets were considerable. In London alone, it was estimated that dozens of nightclubs and gambling establishments were paying regular protection money to organised criminal groups by the mid-1960s. Armed robbery also became increasingly common during this period. The Great Train Robbery of 1963, in which a gang stole over $2.6 million from a Royal Mail train travelling between Glasgow and London, demonstrated both the potential profits from well-planned robberies and the increasingly bold nature of criminal enterprises in Britain. While the majority of the gang involved in that particular robbery were eventually apprehended and imprisoned, the incident inspired numerous other criminals to attempt similar operations. Bank robberies, security van hijackings, and warehouse thefts became more frequent throughout the 1960s, with criminal groups employing increasing levels of planning and violence to carry out these operations. The territorial structure of gang operations became more formalized during this period. In London, different criminal organizations established control over specific areas of the city, with boundaries between territories being strictly maintained through threat of violence. The East End of London became the domain of certain gangs, while South London was controlled by others. Similar territorial divisions emerged in other major cities, with specific neighbourhoods in Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool and Glasgow being controlled by particular criminal organisations. These territories provided a base for various illegal activities, including gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, and, increasingly, drug dealing. Violence became more systematic and business-oriented during this period, where the Victorian gangs had engaged in street brawls and relatively spontaneous violence. The criminal organisations of the 1960s used violence as a calculated tool for maintaining control and eliminating competition, Beatings, stabbings, and shootings were carried out not in moments of heated confrontation, but as deliberate acts intended to send messages to rivals, enforce discipline within organizations, or intimidate potential witnesses. The level of violence employed by some gangs during this period was extreme, with victims subjected to torture as a means of extracting information or as punishment for perceived transgressions. The involvement of organized crime groups in drug trafficking began tentatively in the 1960s and expanded considerably in the 1970s. Cannabis was the primary drug being trafficked during the 1960s, with criminal organizations establishing connections with suppliers in countries such as Morocco, Lebanon, and Pakistan to import the drug into Britain. The profits from cannabis trafficking were substantial, with markup between wholesale and retail prices often exceeding several 100%. By the early 1970s, organized criminal groups in London, Manchester, and other major cities had established sophisticated distribution networks for cannabis, with the drug being transported from ports and airports to safe houses and then distributed to street-level dealers. Heroin trafficking also began during this period, though on a much smaller scale than cannabis. The drug was primarily imported from Turkey and other Middle Eastern countries, often through connections with criminal organizations in continental Europe. The market for heroin in Britain was limited during the 1960s, but expanded considerably in the 1970s, particularly in areas of high unemployment, where addiction rates increased substantially. Criminal organizations which controlled heroin distribution were able to generate enormous profits as the drug commanded high prices, and users, once addicted, represented a reliable customer base. The relationship between organized crime and legitimate business also became more complex during this period. Criminals with substantial proceeds from illegal activities began investing in legitimate businesses such as property development, nightclubs, restaurants, and taxi firms. These businesses served multiple purposes, providing a means of laundering illegally obtained money, generating legitimate income, which could be reported to tax authorities, and creating a veneer of respectability for individuals who were, in reality, career criminals. Some criminals were successful in maintaining the appearance of being legitimate businessmen while continuing to oversee criminal enterprises, and were able to move in circles which included politicians, entertainers, and other prominent individuals. The police response to organized crime during the 1960s and 1970s was often inadequate. Corruption within police forces, particularly in London, meant that some criminal organizations were able to operate with relative impunity by paying bribes to officers. Even where police were not actively corrupt, the sophistication of the criminal organizations and their use of violence and intimidation against witnesses made successful prosecutions difficult. Conviction rates for serious organized crime offenses remained low throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, and many prominent criminals operated openly despite being widely known to be involved in illegal activities. Before long, the criminal organizations which had emerged during the 1960s had established themselves as powerful and enduring enterprises. The profits from their activities, particularly drug trafficking, allowed them to expand their operations, recruit additional members, and acquire firearms to protect their territories and interests. And little did they know it at the time, but the foundations for what would become decades of gang violence and drug-related crime across Britain had been firmly established. The most prominent amongst these criminal organisations in London during the 1960s were almost over before they ever really got going. And the most prominent criminal organisations in London during the 1960s were almost over before they ever really got going. The identical twin brothers Ronald Kray and Reginald Kray were born on the 24th of October 1933 in Hoxton, in the East End area of London. Their father, Charles David Kray, worked sporadically as a wardrobe dealer and was often absent from the family home, while their mother, Violet Annie Lee, raised the twins and their older brother Charles in a two-room flat in Valence Road in Bethnal Green. The family lived in poverty for much of the twins' childhood, though Violet maintained a close relationship with her sons throughout their lives. Both Ronald and Reginald showed early promise as amateur boxers in their teenage years, competing in local boxing clubs in the East End during the late 1940s. However, their boxing careers were interrupted by national service in the Royal Fusiliers in 1952, from which they repeatedly deserted and for which they were eventually dishonorably discharged after spending time in military prison. By the mid-1950s, both twins had become involved in organised crime in the East End, initially operating protection rackets in their local area before gradually expanding their operations. In 1956, the Kray twins acquired a billiard hall in Mile End, which became the headquarters for their criminal organisation known as the Firm. Over the following years, they expanded their operations considerably, acquiring or taking control of numerous nightclubs, gambling establishments, and other businesses across the East End and into the West End of London. By the early 1960s, the firm controlled extensive protection rackets, with dozens of businesses paying regular sums to avoid violence and intimidation. The twins also became involved in illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, and fraud, generating substantial income from these enterprises. The Krays cultivated relationships with celebrities, politicians, and prominent businessmen during the 1960s, hosting parties at their nightclubs and being photographed with well-known figures from the entertainment industry. This veneer of respectability helped to shield them from law enforcement scrutiny, and despite being widely known as criminals, they maintained a public profile as successful East End businessmen. Ronald Kray, however, was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic in 1958, and his mental health problems led to increasingly erratic and violent behavior throughout the 1960s. The violence employed by the Kray twins to maintain their control was systematic and brutal. Members of the firm carried out beatings, stabbings, and shootings of rivals and those who refused to cooperate with the organization's demands. On the 9th of March, 1966, Ronald Kray walked into the Blind Beggar public house in Whitechapel, in the East End of London, and shot George Cornell, a member of a rival gang, in the head with a 9mm Mauser pistol, killing him instantly. The murder occurred in front of numerous witnesses, but intimidation ensured that no one was willing to provide evidence to police at the time. Meanwhile, in South London, a separate criminal organisation was operating under the control of brothers Charles Richardson and Edward Richardson. Charles Richardson, the older of the two, had been born on the 18th of January 1934 in Camberwell in South London, while Edward Richardson was born on the 21st of January 1936. The Richardson gang controlled territories in South London, including Camberwell, Peckham and Brixton, and were involved in similar criminal activities to the Cray organization, including protection rackets, illegal gambling, and fraud. The Richardson Gang became particularly notorious for the extreme violence employed in their operations. Members of the gang subjected victims to systematic torture, including beatings with clubs, the removal of teeth with pliers, and electric shocks administered using a generator. These torture sessions, often carried out at a scrap metal yard which the gang controlled, were used to extract information, punish those who had transgressed against the organization, or intimidate others into compliance. The methods employed by the Richardson Gang were so extreme that when details eventually emerged in court proceedings, they shocked even experienced police officers and judges. The Richardson Gang's operations extended beyond South London, with connections to criminal organizations in other parts of Britain and in South Africa, where Charles Richardson had business interests. The gang was involved in various fraudulent schemes, including long-firm fraud, in which businesses were established, large quantities of goods were purchased on credit, and the businesses were then liquidated before payment was made. These frauds generated substantial sums of money, though exact figures were difficult to determine, as the gang maintained few financial records. Tensions between the Cray organization and the Richardson Gang remained limited for much of the 1960s, as the two groups operated in different areas of London and there was an informal agreement to respect territorial boundaries. However, conflicts did occasionally occur, and violence between members of the two organizations was not uncommon. The Richardson Gang began to suffer significant setbacks in 1966 when a fight broke out at a nightclub in Catford in South London on the 7th of March, resulting in the shooting of Richard Hart, an associate of the gang, who died from his injuries. The incident led to a major police investigation and ultimately to the arrest of Charles Richardson and numerous other members of the organization. The trial of the Richardson Gang began in April 1967 and lasted for several weeks. Charles Richardson and other senior members of the gang were convicted of numerous offences, including grievous bodily harm, fraud, and affray. Charles Richardson was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, while Edward Richardson received a sentence of 15 years. The trial, which became known as the torture trial, owing to the evidence presented about the gang's methods, attracted enormous media attention and provided the public with detailed insight into the violent world of organized crime in London. The Cray twins continued their operations following the imprisonment of the Richardson Gang, but their position was becoming increasingly precarious. On the 28th of October 1967, Reginald Cray murdered Jack Dennis McVitie, known as Jack the Hat, owing to his habit of wearing a hat to cover his baldness, at a basement flat in Stoke Newington in North London. McVitie, a minor criminal who had previously worked for the firm, had become a problem for the Crays owing to his drug use and unreliable behavior. Reginald Cray stabbed McVitie repeatedly, killing him, and the body was never recovered. The murders of Cornell and McVitie, along with mounting evidence of the firm's other criminal activities, eventually provided sufficient basis for police to move against the Cray organization. On the 8th of May 1968, Scotland Yard launched a major operation in which Ronald Cray, Reginald Cray, and numerous other members of the firm were arrested simultaneously at locations across London. Over the following months, witnesses were gradually persuaded to provide evidence and charges were brought against the twins for the murders of Cornell and McVitie, as well as for numerous other offences. The trial of the Kray twins began in January 1969 at the Old Bailey in London and attracted enormous public attention. Ronald Kray and Reginald Kray were both found guilty of the murders of Cornell and McVitie, as well as other offences, and on the 8th of March 1969, they were each sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that they serve at least 30 years. Numerous other members of the firm also received lengthy prison sentences for their involvement in the organization's activities. Ronald Kray died in Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric hospital, on the 17th of March 1995 at the age of 61, having served 26 years in prison and psychiatric detention. Reginald Kray died in prison on the 1st of October 2000 at the age of 66, having served 31 years. Charles Richardson was released from prison in 1984 after serving 17 years of his sentence. With the imprisonment of the Krays and the Richardsons, an era of organised crime in London had come to an end, but the vacuum they left would soon be filled by other criminal organisations, which were emerging in London and across Britain during the same period. While the Krays and Richardsons were establishing their criminal empires in London, criminal organisations were also consolidating their control in other major British cities during the 1960s and into the 1970s. In Manchester, approximately 320 kilometres to the northwest of London, organised criminal groups had emerged in areas such as Moss Side, Cheetham Hill and Salford. These gangs were involved in protection rackets, armed robbery and illegal gambling, with territorial boundaries being strictly maintained through violence and intimidation. The Quality Street Gang, which operated in the Moss Side area from the 1960s onwards, controlled much of the illegal gambling and drug dealing in their territory and were involved in numerous violent confrontations with rival groups. Liverpool, situated approximately 280 kilometres to the northwest of London on the River Mersey, also developed significant organised crime operations during this period. The city's status as a major port made it an ideal location for smuggling operations, and criminal organisations in Liverpool became involved in the importation of drugs, tobacco, and other contraband goods. Gangs operating in areas such as Toxteth and Kirkdale controlled street-level crime in their neighbourhoods and were involved in armed robberies of banks, security vans, and warehouses. The level of violence in Liverpool's gang conflicts was considerable, with shootings and stabbings occurring regularly as rival groups fought for control of lucrative criminal enterprises. In Birmingham, approximately 180 kilometres to the northwest of London in the West Midlands, criminal organisations operated in areas including Handsworth, Aston and Small Heath. These gangs were primarily involved in protection rackets, illegal gambling and armed robbery during the 1960s and 1970s, though drug trafficking would become increasingly important in subsequent decades. The city's substantial immigrant population, particularly from the Caribbean and South Asia, meant that gang membership became increasingly diverse during this period, with criminal organisations recruiting from multiple ethnic communities. Glasgow, approximately 640 kilometres to the north of London in Scotland, had a long history of gang violence dating back to the razor gangs of the early 20th century. By the 1960s and 1970s, organised criminal groups in Glasgow were operating in areas such as the Gorbals, Easterhouse and Possil. These gangs were involved in protection rackets, illegal money lending, and armed robbery, and the level of violence in Glasgow was among the highest in Britain. Stabbings and slashings were particularly common, and the murder rate in Glasgow was consistently higher than in most English cities during this period. Elsewhere, cities such as Newcastle, Leeds, and Bristol also had established criminal organisations operating in specific neighbourhoods. In Newcastle upon Tyne, approximately 440 kilometres to the north of London, gangs controlled areas of the city and were involved in various criminal enterprises, including protection rackets and theft. These operations, while smaller in scale than those in London, Manchester, or Glasgow, nonetheless represented significant criminal activity and generated substantial profits for those involved. And these were only the most prominent of the criminal organisations operating across Britain during the 1960s and 1970s. However, by the late 1970s and into the 1980s, a new element was introduced into British organised crime, which would transform the nature of gang activity in the country. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, a new element was introduced into British organised crime, which would transform the nature of gang activity in the country. Jamaican immigration to Britain had begun in earnest following the Second World War, with the arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks in Essex on the 22nd of June 1948, marking the beginning of large-scale migration from the Caribbean. Between 1948 and 1971, approximately 500,000 people migrated from the Caribbean to Britain, with a substantial proportion coming from Jamaica. Many of these migrants settled in areas of London including Brixton, Hackney, Tottenham, and Harlesden, as well as in other cities such as Birmingham, Manchester, and Bristol. The children of these migrants, born and raised in Britain during the 1960s and 1970s, faced considerable economic marginalisation and discrimination. By the early 1980s, some individuals within these communities had become involved in organised crime, drawing on connections to Jamaica and importing the gang culture which had developed in Kingston and other Jamaican cities. These gangs, which became known as Yardie gangs, owing to the Jamaican term for someone from one's home area or yard, operated with levels of violence which were extreme even by the standards of British organised crime at the time. The introduction of crack cocaine to Britain in the mid-1980s provided enormous opportunities for profit and fundamentally altered the drug trade. Crack cocaine, a smokable form of cocaine which is significantly more addictive than the powdered form of the drug, had first appeared in the United States in the early 1980s and rapidly spread to Britain. Yardie gangs established themselves as major importers and distributors of crack cocaine in London and other cities, using connections in Jamaica and other Caribbean countries to source the drug. The profits from crack cocaine trafficking were substantially greater than those from cannabis or heroin. As the drug commanded high prices and users, once addicted, required regular purchases to sustain their addiction. The methods of violence employed by Yardie gangs were particularly brutal. Shootings were carried out in public locations with little concern for witnesses or collateral damage, and the use of automatic weapons became increasingly common. Victims were often shot multiple times, and the practice of shooting individuals in the legs or kneecaps as a form of punishment or warning became associated with Yardie gang activity. This extreme violence served both to intimidate rivals and to establish dominance in the crack cocaine trade. and it had a profound impact on the neighborhoods where these gangs operated. Yardie gangs established control over specific areas of London during the 1980s, with Hackney, Brixton, and Harlesden becoming particular centres of their activity. In these areas, crack houses were established where the drug could be purchased and consumed, and street-level dealing became endemic. The gangs also expanded their operations to other cities, with Birmingham, Manchester, and Bristol all seeing the establishment of Yardie gang operations during the late 1980s and early 1990s. As a result, crack cocaine use increased substantially in Britain during this period, with estimates suggesting that tens of thousands of people had become addicted to the drug by the early 1990s. The introduction of Yardie gangs and the crack cocaine trade also forced established British gangs to adapt their operations. Traditional criminal organisations, which had previously dominated drug dealing in specific areas, found themselves in violent competition with these new groups, and many British gangs began to adopt similar methods of extreme violence in order to maintain their control of territories and drug markets. The result was an escalation in gang-related violence across Britain's major cities during the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The introduction of Yardie gangs and the crack cocaine trade had fundamentally altered the landscape of British organised crime. With the expansion of the drug trade and the increasing violence associated with it, came an escalation in the use of firearms across Britain's major cities. With the expansion of the drug trade and the increasing violence associated with it, came an escalation in the use of firearms across Britain's major cities during the 1990s and into the early 2000s. The availability of guns increased substantially during this period, with weapons being smuggled into Britain from continental Europe or acquired through the conversion of replica firearms into working weapons. Handguns, shotguns, and semi-automatic weapons became increasingly common among gang members, and shootings, which had previously been relatively rare events, became a regular feature of gang conflicts in cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and London. Manchester experienced particularly intense gang warfare during the 1990s and early 2000s. The Gooch Close Gang, which operated in the Moss Side area of the city, was engaged in a prolonged conflict with the Doddington Gang, which controlled territory in the adjacent Longside area. The conflict between these two organisations was primarily driven by competition over drug-dealing territories, with both gangs seeking to control the lucrative crack cocaine market in South Manchester. The violence between the groups was extreme, with drive-by shootings, ambushes, and public assassinations occurring regularly throughout the 1990s. On the 9th of January 1991, a member of the Gooch Close Gang was shot and injured in a nightclub in Moss Side, an incident which marked the beginning of an intensification of violence between the two groups. Over the following years, numerous shootings occurred as the gangs targeted each other's members. On the 14th of March 1999, Wukal Chin, a 17-year-old gang member, was shot and killed in Moss Side. Later that same year, on the 13th of August, Dorrie Mackenzie was shot and killed in a case of mistaken identity, illustrating the dangers posed to innocent individuals by the ongoing gang conflict. Between 1999 and 2001, it was estimated that over 30 shootings occurred in South Manchester as a result of the conflict between the Gooch Close Gang and the Doddington Gang. The violence in Manchester was not limited to gang members. On the 9th of January 2003, Letitia Shakespeare, aged 17, and Charlene Ellis, aged 18, were shot and killed outside a New Year party in Aston, Birmingham, in an incident carried out by members of a Manchester gang who had travelled to Birmingham seeking revenge against rivals. The two young women had no involvement in gang activity, and their deaths shocked the nation, drawing attention to the extent to which gang violence was affecting innocent members of communities. Meanwhile, Liverpool was experiencing similar levels of gun violence during the same period. The city had numerous gang factions operating in areas such as Toxteth, Croxteth, and Norris Green, with conflicts between these groups resulting in regular shootings. The gangs in Liverpool were primarily involved in drug trafficking, and territorial disputes over control of drug-dealing areas led to sustained violence throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. Drive-by shootings became common, with gang members using motorcycles or cars to approach targets and open fire before fleeing the scene. In Birmingham, approximately 130 kilometres to the southeast of Manchester, gang conflicts also intensified during the 1990s and early 2000s. The Johnson Crew and other gangs operating in areas such as Handsworth and Aston were involved in violent territorial disputes, with shootings occurring regularly. The availability of firearms in Birmingham increased substantially during this period, with police seizures of weapons rising year on year. In 2003 alone, Birmingham saw 47 shootings related to gang activity, a figure which represented a significant increase compared to previous years. London experienced a shift in gang structure during this period, with the emergence of postcode gangs. Unlike the large, organised crime groups such as the Cray organisation, which had controlled extensive territories, postcode gangs were smaller groups of young men who claimed specific neighbourhoods or even individual housing estates as their territory. These gangs identified themselves by the postcodes of their areas, such as the Peckham Boys in the SE15 postcode area, or the Tottenham Mandem in the N17 area. Conflicts between postcode gangs were often driven by historical grievances and perceived disrespect rather than purely economic competition, though control of drug-dealing territories remained a significant factor. The fragmentation of gang territories in London meant that the number of active gangs increased substantially during the 1990s and early 2000s. By 2006, the Metropolitan Police estimated that there were over 170 active gangs operating in London, with a total membership of approximately 2,500 individuals. The smaller size of these gangs did not result in less violence, however, and shootings and stabbings between rival postcode gangs were frequent. The connection between gang activity and the emerging grime music scene in London also became apparent during this period, with some artists having connections to gangs and lyrics referencing ongoing conflicts. In Glasgow, gun violence also increased during the 1990s and into the 2000s. The city had a long history of gang violence, and the introduction of firearms to these conflicts resulted in numerous shooting incidents. Gangs in areas such as Easterhouse, Postle, and Drumchapel were involved in territorial disputes, which frequently escalated to armed violence. In 2004, Glasgow recorded 58 shooting incidents, a figure which placed it among the most violent cities in Britain in terms of gun crime. By the early 2000s, Britain's major cities had seen levels of gun violence that were unprecedented in the post-war period. The gun violence was not simply the result of territorial disputes, over drug markets, but was increasingly linked to Britain's urban youth culture itself. By the early 21st century, the nature of gang activity in Britain had evolved yet again, with younger members, more fragmented territories, and increasingly public displays of violence. The large organized crime groups which had dominated gang activity in the latter half of the 20th century were increasingly replaced by smaller street-level gangs, often consisting of teenagers and young men in their early 20s. These gangs claimed territories which were sometimes no larger than a single housing estate or even individual tower blocks, and conflicts between groups operating in adjacent areas became increasingly common. The postcode gang structure, which had emerged in London during the 1990s, became the dominant model for gang organisation in Britain's major cities during the 2000s and 2010s. These gangs identified themselves by the postcodes of their territories and viewed members of gangs from rival postcodes as enemies, regardless of whether there were any economic disputes between the groups. The fragmentation of gang territories meant that cities such as London, Birmingham, and Manchester each had dozens of active gangs operating simultaneously, with conflicts between multiple groups occurring at the same time. Youth involvement in gang activity increased substantially during this period. While earlier generations of gang members had typically been in their 20s or older, by the 2010s it was not uncommon for gang members to be in their mid-teens. Some individuals as young as 12 or 13 were being recruited into gangs, often to carry out drug dealing or to act as lookouts for older members. The involvement of such young individuals in serious criminal activity represented a significant shift in the nature of British gang culture and posed considerable challenges for law enforcement and social services. The escalation in knife crime during the 2010s became a defining feature of modern gang violence in Britain. While firearms remained in use by some gangs, knives became the predominant weapon for gang-related violence, particularly among younger members. The number of knife crime offences recorded by police in England and Wales increased from approximately 26,000 in 2012 to over 46,000 by 2019, an increase of nearly 80% in 7 years. Much of this increase was concentrated in major cities, with London accounting for a substantial proportion of knife crime incidents. The connection between gang culture and drill music became increasingly apparent during the 2010s. Drill music, a subgenre of hip-hop which had originated in Chicago in the early 2010s, was adopted by young people in London and other British cities. The music, characterized by dark beats and lyrics, which often referenced gang violence, drug dealing, and conflicts with rival groups, became closely associated with gang activity. Some drill artists had direct connections to gangs, and lyrics in drill songs were used as evidence in criminal trials, with prosecutors arguing that the songs documented real criminal activities or incited violence against rivals. The extent to which drill music was a cause or merely a reflection of gang violence became a subject of considerable debate, with some arguing that the music glorified violence, while others maintained that it simply documented the reality of life in deprived urban areas. County lines drug operations emerged as a major form of organized crime during the 2010s. These operations involved gangs from major cities, particularly London, establishing drug dealing networks in smaller towns and rural areas across Britain. The gangs would identify vulnerable individuals, including children and adults with drug addictions or mental health problems and exploit them by taking over their homes to use as bases for drug dealing, a practice known as cuckooing. Young people were recruited to transport drugs and money between cities and county lines locations, often traveling by train and using mobile phones to coordinate operations. The scale of county lines operations expanded rapidly during the 2010s. By 2019, the National Crime Agency estimated that there were approximately 2,000 county lines operating across England and Wales, with around 27,000 young people involved in these operations. The violence associated with county lines included not only conflicts between rival groups seeking to control specific territories, but also violence directed at those who were being exploited by the gangs. Victims of cuckooing were subjected to intimidation and violence if they attempted to resist the gangs taking over their homes. Social media platforms became integral to gang culture during the 2010s. Gang members used platforms such as YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat to taunt rivals, document their activities, and recruit new members. Videos of violent incidents were sometimes posted online, and social media disputes between gang members frequently escalated to real-world violence. The public nature of these conflicts, conducted through social media, platforms visible to anyone, represented a significant departure from the more secretive operations of earlier criminal organizations. The combination of these factors had created a situation where gang violence in Britain was becoming increasingly public, increasingly young, and increasingly deadly. Some of the most notorious incidents in recent years have demonstrated the extreme nature of this modern gang violence in Britain. Some of the most notorious incidents in recent years have demonstrated the extreme nature of modern gang violence in Britain. On the 22nd of August 2007, Rhys Jones, an 11-year-old boy, was shot and killed in the car park of the Fir Tree Public House in the Croxteth area of Liverpool. Rhys had been walking home from football practice when he was caught in the crossfire of a dispute between the Croxteth crew and the Norris Green Strand gang. Sean Mercer, a 16-year-old member of the Croxteth crew, had fired shots at members of the rival gang, and one of the bullets struck Rhys in the back, killing him. Mercer was subsequently convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. On the 29th of June 2008, Ben Kinsella, a 16-year-old student, was stabbed to death in Islington in North London following an altercation at a bar. Kinsella had been celebrating the end of his school examinations when a dispute broke out, and he was pursued by 3 men who stabbed him multiple times. Joris Kika, Jade Braithwaite, and Michael Alani were subsequently convicted of his murder and received life sentences. The case attracted significant media attention owing to Kinsella's age and the fact that he had no involvement in gang activity. Other incidents involving innocent victims included the murder of Damilola Taylor, a 10-year-old boy who was stabbed in Peckham in South London on the 27th of November 2000 as he walked home from an after-school computer club. 2 brothers, Danny and Ricky Preddy, were convicted of his manslaughter in 2006. On the 26th of December 2011, Anuj Bidva, a 23-year-old Indian student, was shot and killed in Salford in Greater Manchester in an apparently random attack carried out by Kieran Stapleton, a local gang member. Cases of mistaken identity also resulted in numerous murders of individuals who had no connection to gang activity. Victims were killed because they were in the wrong location at the wrong time, or because they were mistaken for members of rival gangs. The level of violence in some incidents was extreme, with victims being stabbed dozens of times or shot multiple times at close range. Public spaces, including streets, parks, and shopping areas, were frequently the locations of these attacks, contributing to fear among residents of areas affected by gang activity. These incidents, while among the most notorious, represent only a fraction of the gang-related violence occurring across Britain. In response to this escalating violence, law enforcement agencies have developed increasingly sophisticated methods to combat organized gang activity. In response to the escalating gang violence, law enforcement agencies across Britain have developed increasingly sophisticated methods to combat organized criminal activity. Specialist units dedicated to gang-related crime were established in major cities during the 1990s and 2000s. In London, Operation Trident was established in 1998 by the Metropolitan Police to investigate gun crime in the capital's black communities, initially focusing on drug-related shootings in areas such as Lambeth, Southwark, and Hackney. The operation resulted in hundreds of arrests and convictions over the following years, with significant numbers of firearms being seized. Major police operations targeting specific gangs were conducted across Britain during the 2000s and 2010s. In Manchester, Operation Excalibur was launched in 2004 to combat gun crime in the city, particularly in the Moss Side and Longside areas where gang violence had been most intense. The operation involved increased police presence in affected areas, targeted arrests of known gang members, and the use of surveillance technology to gather evidence. Similar operations were conducted in Liverpool, Birmingham, and other cities, with varying degrees of success in reducing gang activity. Legislative tools to combat gang activity were also introduced. Gang injunctions, which allow courts to impose restrictions on the individual's behavior and association with other gang members, were introduced under the Policing and Crime Act 2009. By 2015, over 200 gang injunctions had been issued across England and Wales, though their effectiveness in reducing gang membership and violence remained subject to debate. The use of joint enterprise laws, whereby individuals could be convicted of murders or other serious crimes committed by associates even if they did not directly participate, also became more common in gang-related prosecutions, though these laws proved controversial owing to concerns about their application. Convictions for gang-related offences increased during the 2010s, with lengthy prison sentences being imposed on gang members convicted of murder, firearms offences, and drug trafficking. However, significant challenges remained. Witness intimidation made prosecutions difficult, with many victims and witnesses refusing to cooperate with police owing to fear of reprisals. The use of encrypted communications by gang members made surveillance more difficult, while debates about the use of drill music lyrics as evidence in trials raised concerns about freedom of expression. While these efforts have had some success in dismantling specific criminal organizations, the broader problem of gang culture in Britain remains. The current state of gang activity in Britain continues to evolve. The current state of gang activity in Britain continues to evolve, with new challenges emerging even as law enforcement adapts its methods. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in 2020, had a significant impact on gang operations. with lockdown measures initially disrupting drug distribution networks and reducing street-level violence. However, gangs adapted quickly to the new circumstances, with county lines operations continuing throughout the pandemic period, and some gangs exploiting vulnerable individuals who were isolated during lockdowns. Knife crime statistics in England and Wales showed a slight decrease during 2020 owing to lockdown restrictions, with approximately 41,000 offences recorded compared to 46,000 in 2019. However, by 2022, knife crime had returned to pre-pandemic levels, with over 45,000 offences recorded. London continued to account for a substantial proportion of knife crime, with approximately 12,000 offences in the capital in 2022. Other cities, including Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool, also recorded high levels of knife crime, with specific neighbourhoods in these cities being disproportionately affected. Gang membership estimates remain difficult to determine precisely, but police intelligence suggests that tens of thousands of young people are involved in gang activity across Britain. The Metropolitan Police estimated in 2022 that there were approximately 250 active gangs in London, with a combined membership of several thousand individuals. Similar patterns exist in other major cities, with Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow all having numerous active gangs operating in specific territorial areas. Recent developments include the increasing use of encrypted messaging applications by gang members to coordinate criminal activities and avoid police surveillance. Applications such as EncroChat and Sky ECC were widely used by criminals until law enforcement agencies successfully infiltrated these networks in 2020 and 2021, leading to hundreds of arrests. However, gangs have subsequently moved to other encrypted platforms, creating an ongoing challenge for police. Social media continues to play a role in gang conflicts, with disputes conducted online frequently escalating to violence. The use of drill music as evidence in criminal trials has also continued, with several high-profile cases in recent years involving gang members being convicted partly on the basis of lyrics referencing violent incidents. Gang culture in Britain has evolved significantly over the past century and a half, but shows little sign of disappearing. The impact of gang activity on British society extends far beyond the immediate victims of violence. The impact of gang activity on British society extends far beyond the immediate victims of violence. Communities in areas affected by gang activity have experienced significant deterioration in quality of life, with residents living in fear of violence and businesses closing owing to intimidation and protection rackets. Housing estates in cities such as London, Manchester, and Birmingham, which have been dominated by gang activity, have seen property values decline, and residents move away when financially able to do so. The economic costs of gang-related crime are substantial. Estimates suggest that organised crime costs the British economy billions of pounds annually through direct losses from theft and fraud, costs associated with law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and lost economic productivity. Healthcare costs associated with treating victims of gang violence are also considerable, with knife and gunshot wounds requiring extensive medical treatment and long-term rehabilitation. The social costs of gang culture include the perpetuation of cycles of violence and poverty. Young people growing up in areas dominated by gang activity often see gang membership as inevitable or even aspirational, particularly when legitimate economic opportunities are limited. The glamorization of gang culture in music and media has been subject to ongoing debate, with some arguing that this contributes to the normalization of violence among young people. Consequently, while some areas of Britain have seen reductions in gang violence in recent years, the underlying conditions which allowed gangs to flourish, poverty, lack of opportunity, and social fragmentation, remain prevalent in many communities. What do you think of Britain's gang culture? Has law enforcement done enough to combat organized crime? Or are the social conditions that create gangs the real issue that needs addressing? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.